Okay, so this is Chapter 6, Part B of bone and skeletal tissue. And so in Part A, we really discuss bone tissue itself and look at how bone forms spongy and compact. So we've gone through that. We've actually looked through some of that, look at some of the structures, including cells and their function. And so now we're looking, kind of stepping back just a little bit, discussing really how bone develops, and so we'll take a look at that there, and then we'll also look at some fractures, some bone breakages, and then finally we'll look at some diseases as well, and so cover some of that also, right? And so when we talk about bone development is also known as ossification or osteogenesis. And this is really how bone will form, right? And so we really got to take a look going back into fetal development, and we really start at month 2 or the 8-week term of fetal development, where we see forming of the bony skeleton. So we now actually are at a time frame where we're seeing actually cells forming cartilage per se, and that's really how bone forms first, cartilage, and then filling that bone with minerals or ossifying that bone. And so when we take a look at bone and, for example, skeleton in week 8 and looking at bone, we can already start to see the formation of the skeleton here, right? So postnatal, right? So after birth, we start to even then see bone growth all the way up to early adulthood, and that's into puberty and really into adulthood, which vary, but that's 18 to 21, 23 is really where we see early adulthood, and that's post-puberty, right? And even at that, we have a tremendous amount of bone remodeling and repair even after that point. So having said that, we are still remodeling bone, still forming bone, and adjusting and modifying all of this bone, and even repairing bone based on environmental exposure. So, we put on extra weight, we lose extra weight, we move around, we gain muscle. That is all going to then affect how bone is reshaped and reformed. Okay, so again, kind of going back to week 8, we see fibrous cartilage, in fact, and hyaline cartilage in the fetal skeleton first form, as I mentioned, and then it gets replaced with bone tissue. And so we do 2 types of ossification or bone development: endochondral ossification and intramembranous ossification. This, in endochondral ossification, bone really forms by replacing the hyaline cartilage that has actually originally been formed, and we call this cartilage bones. Most of your skeleton is cartilage or endochondral bone, whereas it replaces the cartilage. And when we talk about intramembranous ossification, this really is where bone is forming from fibrous membrane. So again, we have 2 types of really connective tissue per se: fibrous connective tissue and hyaline cartilage, both forming our complete skeleton, and then most of our skeleton comes from the replacement of the hyaline cartilage through endochondral ossification. And when we replace fibrous membrane or fibrous connective tissue, we call that intramembranous ossification, and those are called membranous or membrane bone. So let's take a look at endochondral ossification. These are all bones that are past or underneath the base of the skull, with the exception of the clavicle. So really that means all the bones, that's not the skull and not the clavicles, are undergo endochondral ossification, right? And so this is the hyaline cartilage being replaced. Okay, intramembranous ossification is the skull and the clavicles. Again, month 2 is our key, and actually the late part of the 8th week is where we start forming this. And again, we're replacing that hyaline cartilage with bone tissue. We actually break down cartilage and then we ossify. This starts at what we call the primary ossification center in the center of the hyaline cartilage. And then we start to see this process of it turning into finally bone. So here is the, it's actually a 5-step process, and here are the 5 steps of forming this process of intracondylar ossification, right? And we'll you see the first here, step 4 and step 5, but I'd like to really look at figure to kind of put that into context, right? So this is figure 610 in the text, and we look at step 1 in the fact that we see this blue color, and this represents the hyaline cartilage, and then we start to see at the center of the hyaline cartilage what we call the primary ossification center. The primary ossification center is where hyaline cartilage starts to turn into bone or bone tissue. And we start with this right in the center of the hyaline cartilage. And then you start to see not only the center, but the lateral ends outside the center forming what we call a bone collar, right? And when we took a look at part A, we took a look at a long bone per se, and took a look at an area called the diaphysis or diaphysis. And that's the shaft, if you will, of a long bone, and this is where we're at as far as this bone collar forming. We see that in step 1. Step 2, we start to see, and then you can also see how we start with week 9. This is the late part of week 8 into week 9. Step 2, cartilage then calcifies, and we can see this occurring here in the center, in the diaphysis. We start to form cavities in this area. And again, we're starting to form not only compact bone, but also spongy bone as well. And we begin to see that. And this starts to extend all the way up to the distal and proximal end of the long bone, right? And so just to kind of review that, this could be the distal or this could be the proximal end, but the ends of the long bone. And we start to see movement or ossification or calcification from the center out. That's kind of what you see there, right? Step 3, we start to see what we know to be the peristeal bud. This is a formation of the blood vessel system or the vascularization system starting to feed nutrients, oxygen, starting to form new cells. And this is why we see this blood connection forming in the center here, and this is called the peristeal bud. We see a further development in stage 4 of the elongation of the diaphysis, so we see bone here as well forming. It elongates. We start to see a medullary cavity where you don't see actually fat yet, but that will be filled with fat, right? And so we see that as well. And then we start to see these secondary ossification centers, and we see that on the very top and at the bottom. So we start to form that at the very ends. Now you'll notice that we're now at birth, right? So we still see that the bone tissue is not fully bone tissue. Many of the bones that we have in birth are still somewhat cartilage, right? Still soft bone. And so that then will become a full bone later on, and that's kind of what you see here from a child to an adolescence. And you can see where the primary ossification center becomes the diaphysis, and then you start to see the secondary ossification centers become the ends there, the epiphysis, if you will, ends of the long bone. And you can see, again, the epiphyseal plate, right? The epiphyseal plate extends the bone, right? So lengthwise, you see this kind of extension happening from the epiphyseal plate, because this cartilage can actually divide and actually make the bone longer. This will occur, for example, in puberty. So once puberty will begin, we start to see the lengthening of these bones at a very rapid pace, and you start to see the young child sprout, if you will. So you see these kind of growing, sprouting, if you will, and this is where that occurs, right? Okay, and so when we talk about intramembranous ossification, this is the fibrous connective tissue, as I mentioned, turning into then full bone. And as I mentioned, this is all your skull bones and then also your clavicles. So that's why you see frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and the clavicle bone. The first four of which are the skull bones, and the clavicle is also known as your collarbone. These all form through intramembranous ossification, and we began with those being the mesenchymal cells, right? And so there is also a four-step process there for intramembranous ossification, and we see that there as well. So we start to see the mesenchymal cells, the ossification center in the center of the fibrous tissue, and then we start to see these new cells forming into mesenchymal cells, forming into many of these cells, the osteoblasts. We start to see osteons and osteocytes, which help regulate and remodel, and we start to see, again, this forming. And if you look at this last step there, you see compact bone on either end, and you see spongy bone in the middle. And we know that flat bones, for example, that form the skull, these are flat bones, are what we call a dipole, right? Right? That's a dipole. And as I mentioned in part A, this is kind of compact bone sandwiched, that is sandwiching, for example, spongy bone. Little circles represent the sponginess, the holes, if you will. That's called a dipole, and you find this in flat bone. And obviously you can see this here in step 4. And again, this is intramembranous ossification versus endochondral ossification that we saw in long bones, right? So two different formations, but nonetheless forming. Okay, so talking about postnatal bone growth, again, long bones grow lengthwise. Call this longitudinal growth. This is the length, again, going lengthwise, stretching itself out. When we talk about appositional growth, we're talking about getting wider, bones getting thicker. So we see that also. So not only lengthwise, but growing in width. And again, once we hit adolescence, bones per se stop growing, but facial bones, in fact, continue to grow. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon that occurs, but we see facial bones growing still growing after adolescence. Very slowly, but still nonetheless. So when we took a look at length of bone, in particular, the longitudinal growth, as I mentioned, the epiphyseal plate plays the major role in growing the bone lengthwise. And so we see this occurring in these 5 zones, right? The resting zone, proliferation zone, hypertrophic zone, calcification bone zone, and ossification zone. See this here, and I want just to kind of describe each one of what's happening here in the epiphyseal plate. So in the resting zone, it is actually resting, so the cartilage there and the cells of the cartilage remain inactive, and so they don't actually participate in activity. And when we talk about activity in cells like this, we're really talking about mitosis, right? So there is no mitosis occurring here. Now, the row of cells or the arrangement of cells above the resting zone is called the proliferation zone, and this is actually where cartilage is rapidly dividing or undergoing mitosis, right? That's what that really means Rapidly dividing means mitosis. The cells move upwards. We're pushing away from pushing from the epiphysis to the diaphyses, and then causing of the bone. The hypertrophic zone. This is where you start to see chondrocytes close to the diaphysis. We are seeing these cells and the area that they are in, called the lacunae, start to enlarge and erode. And then we have this space forming here. And then we start to see, again, step 4, the calcification zone, where we actually see the matrix of the cartilage becoming calcified. We're adding minerals like magnesium and calcium to this area, filling up the space, okay? And we start to see this hardness of the bone, right? We start to see bone, the characteristic here of bone, right? And ossification, the ossification zone, the last zone, is where we actually seeing this final kind of bone formation, and we see this occurring, right? So moving on to figure 612, and what we're looking at, the x-ray image, if you can look at that square there and notice the line, and I'll just draw the line here on the very top, but there's also a line at the bottom. We're magnifying that gap or that line. The epiphyseal plate is what we're looking at, and the epiphyseal line here, and looking at the actual different zones, right? So on the very top, just to kind of draw a line, is the resting zone. We see the proliferation zone, and this is on the left, the photomicrograph and the drawing. So they do a really good job of almost matching this up exactly. The hypertrophic zone, the calcification zone, and the ossification zone. And this is new bone down here at the bottom. So we're starting, I mean, you got to put it in anatomical position, exactly placed on that. So we're actually seeing bone grow, new bone growth this way, right? So we're seeing new bone growth that way. And in fact, we're seeing it this way, right? So we're seeing bone grow in length this way. If we were to take a look at this line here, where the femur is at, this is actually the femur here, and this is the tibia here. So we're seeing the knee, with the exception of the kneecap missing or taken away, so we can actually see those two long bones. We're seeing that there, and we're seeing bones grow in length in the direction of the arrows. Okay, so at the end of adolescence, these cells, these actively cells that actually undergo mitosis, divide less often, they slow down, and in fact, they actually pretty much disintegrate or die off. The epiphyseal plate will thin off and will be replaced by bone, in fact. And so we see the epiphyseal plate closing, where we see the epiphysis and the diaphysis fuse. But in fact, we still see a line there, okay? But that's a remnants of the old epiphyseal plate. And we actually now call it epiphyseal line, because it no longer divides and grows in length. And again, at the end of adolescence, this is what happens, right? So where does this cease? This is a big range. This is an average, but for females, it's about 18 years. Females mature faster than males, and for males, about 21 years of age, give or take, is where we start to see the end of bone lengthening. Interesting, right? So not only do we grow bone in lengthwise, but we also grow it in thickness or make it wider. We call this appositional growth. Appositional growth. Bones will thicken in response to stresses like muscle activity or added weight or force, right? So if you actually add muscle or you add weight or you work out or you change jobs where you're doing extra force or extra stress on your body, the bones will respond to that stress, and they know from the nervous system, they'll have receptors on the bone that actually measure stress levels. What I mean by physical stress on the bone, and then will respond by adding more bone there and increasing the thickness, right? So lengthwise as an adult, you stay your bones stay the length forever, and actually will shorten slightly, and but yeah, they can become thicker or thinner, right? Osteoblasts do the work here. They actually will secrete bone matrix on the external bone. Osteoclasts, which are the eaters, will remove bone on the endothelial side, the inside, and so we'll see thickness grow on the outside and remodeling, this bone remodeling there, right? So we usually build up more than we break down, and that leads to thicker, stronger bones that are not too heavy. So there is a limit to. Okay. So we actually see this, right? So you see remodeling here. You also see not only just lengthwise, so you can see a big difference in the length of it, but also you can see the difference in width as well. So this dotted line represents the original width of it, and then you see an increase in width. So this is really just showing you remodeling before and after. So I think this is actually really neat to look at, right? Okay, so who regulates bone growth? Just like we saw, for example, in skin, just like we've been seeing in that organ system, the nervous system and the endocrine system vis-a-vis, aka the hormone system, regulate bone growth, right? So growth hormone in particular is the most important hormone that will stimulate that epiphyseal plate activity and growing bone lengthwise. The thyroid hormone actually is a regulator of growth hormone, so it regulates growth hormone. They work together to be responsible for this bone growth, if you will. Testosterone, estrogen, we call these sex hormones at puberty, also regulate bone growth as well. So you have this jump in these two hormones, and that will lead to a jump in the growth of bone. And so when we see an increase or decrease of these hormones, then we've got, of course, abnormalities or these diseases forming, right? So just a little background on just some statistics on bone remodeling. 5 to 7% of your bone mass, your entire weight of your bone, gets recycled each week. So we break that down and build that up. About 5 to 7%. Spongy bone is replaced entirely every 3 to 4 years, and compact bone every 10 years, right? So that's really interesting to look at. Your complete compact bone of your entire body gets replaced every 10 years, and spongy bone every 3 to 4 years, right? Amazing how the body works here, right? And so what do we mean by remodeling? That is actually, and if you haven't figured this out, this is actually what we're talking about, right? Depositing bone, adding bone tissue, and taking bone tissue away. We call this depositing bone and reabsorption, or taking away bone. And again, it's like a sculptor, if you will, like a wall, if you will. You can remodel the wall, you can tear some of it down, you can add more to it. This is actually what's occurring on the surface of bone, right? And who's doing this? We looked at part A, and when you look at part A, we were looking at the cells that you find in bone tissue, but osteoblasts and osteoclasts, one adds to bone and one takes away from bone or eats away at bone. And this is a carefully controlled process. Again, hormones dictate that, right? The taking away of bone is done by the osteoclasts. They actually break down the matrix. And in fact, they secrete these enzymes from the lysosomes, right? The lysosomes in their cells secrete this enzyme and these protons, hydrogen ions that break down the matrix. And there is an acid that is formed from the actual cells, and they break down calcium and convert that, and so it will break down bone, right? Osteoclasts will actually eat away at bone, will actually eat away at dead osteocytes. Osteoclast activation actually involves another hormone. We call that the parathyroid hormone. I help do that, right? Osteoblasts deposit bone, so new bone is made through osteoblasts. Okay, so let's talk about this, right? This controlling and remodeling. This is in fact a feedback system. This is homeostasis in an example here, right? So we see number one, a hormonal control, right? This negative feedback system is monitored, or the homeostatic control is found in the bloodstream, right? So the body is measuring how much calcium you have in the bloodstream. And so we'll see, for example, if you look at a blood panel, you will know a range of blood calcium in the blood, and that's the range that the body wants to stick to, and there will be sensors, receptors gauging that amount of blood calcium. When we see then a decrease or increase of calcium, then we're going to see then bone tissue will increase or decrease the amount of calcium in itself to add to blood, right? We also look at mechanical stress. So I mentioned this also. When there are stresses, physical stresses on bone, that indicates to the body that we need to add more bone, or if you see less stress, take away from bone. So that's also one of the control methods. And then again, hormones, right, are going to be at play to actually help increase or decrease calcium there. And for example, the parathyroid hormone will respond to low blood calcium levels. So when we see low blood calcium levels, parathyroid hormone will secrete out of the parathyroid gland, or glands if you will, and that will stimulate osteoclasts to break down bone at the bone tissue level. And when you break down bone, you release calcium. You release calcium, that calcium is brought to blood. You increase blood calcium levels, right? Homeostatic controls, negative feedback system. When blood calcium levels increase to the desired level, then the parathyroid hormone secretion will stop. Very easy to understand. So understand where calcium's found. You have to understand what osteoclasts do. They eat away at bone. And if we have low blood calcium level, we're going to stimulate osteoclasts again to eat bone, add calcium to blood, blood level goes up, parathyroid hormone secretion stops. On the opposite end, because that's part of the seesaw, remember we talked about homeostasis, seesaw. On the other side of the seesaw, or the balancing beam here, when we have high blood calcium levels, this is going to stimulate calcitonin, and that's found in the parathyroid gland. And by the way, the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland are found in the same area. The parathyroid glands, there are 4 little collections of cells, glands, are found posterior and on the thyroid. And then the thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped gland found in the neck area, right? And so when we have high blood calcium levels, right, calcitonin will be secreted, okay? And calcitonin's responsibility is to cause the osteoblast to then make more bone. And so they will take calcium physically from blood and put it onto or bind it to bone and add to more bone, thereby lowering the high level of calcium in blood to a desired level. And then at that point, calcitonin will cease to be secreted. Right? So here's our balancing beam, figure 614. Here's our balancing beam. If you want to know the blood calcium level, that's the homeostatic control, 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 milliliter of blood. That is your homeostatic level of calcium, blood calcium. And again, this shows you what happens when we have a drop in blood calcium. Here is the parathyroid hormone getting secreted, stimulates osteoclasts to eat bone, releasing calcium into blood, picking up essentially the balancing beam or the seesaw back to normal, right? All right, so blood calcium levels are really important, not only for bone itself, but we see here that it is also really used as well for the nervous system and the muscular system, right? Those two places are where we use calcium, right? These two terms, these medical terms, hypocalcemia and hypercalcemia, talk about if there is low levels of calcium or high levels of calcium, right? So again, these will affect the nervous system and the muscular system depending if it's out of range, right? Now, high levels of calcium in blood can also cause other organs, for example, like deposits of calcium in the blood vessels or in the kidneys, and that can actually cause these stones, right? Or calcaneous deposits. Those are the other way to say them, right? Kidney stone deposit in kidneys, right? Okay, just really quick, just some other hormones that play minor roles here. Leptin is one of them. That's actually released by fat tissue. Actually can influence osteoblasts. Serotonin can also influence osteoblasts. And so we'll talk about a little bit of stress, mechanical stress or physical stress on bones. So again, when there was weight being bared or force or muscle getting pulled, that's usually indicating to parts of the bone to start growing. Wolff's Law, really quick, states that when bone will grow or remodel, it's going to be in response to a demand placed on it. So wherever that demand is on the bone, located on the bone, we will see then bone growing or remodeling based on that, right? So this is Wolff's Law, right? This is just saying, okay, if the tension or the compression is put on bone, we'll see force applied and there'll be a maximum force right here at the dots, right here basically, where the dot is. And because of that, the bone will respond by putting bone tissue, right? Bone tissue will be added here in that area and will cause it to be thicker there in that area or grow a little bit in length, but not too much, right? So point of stress there, you'll see that, right? Okay. Move on from there. Let's talk about fractures really quick. Fractures are actually breaks in bones. Now this can be a wide degree of breaks, if you will, in severity and the type of breaks, and so we'll see this here, right? In youth, most fractures will result from trauma. Some fall, some hits, something like that that you see that result in a fracture are usually what happens in youth, right? Young kids, young children, young adults. We see these types of fractures, and that's really from trauma. When you switch it from youth to old age, the weakness of bones or the breakages are usually from bone thinning, which is a natural process, but also that can be influenced by the environment. So let's define these really quick, right? So we usually classify bone based on these three classifications: where the position is of the bone after the fracture. So if it is non-displaced, then the bone is in its normal position. If it is displaced, it's out of its normal position or alignment, right? So you can classify a fracture based on its position. How broken is it? If it's broken all the way through, we call that complete. If it's broken partially, but not all the way through, we call that incomplete. And finally, if the skin is penetrated, if it is an open or compound fracture, then the skin is penetrated. And if it's closed, it's not penetrated. So again, you can combine all three of these to then classify a fracture. For example, a non-displaced, incomplete, closed fracture, or a displaced, complete, open fracture. And again, we can classify them that way, but some other ones can be classified in different ways. So here's table 6.3-1 and 2 is our next one, and they show you the different types of fractures. And I want you to study comminuted fractures, what a compression fracture is, and again, it's based on force and how that force is applied somewhere, what a spiral fracture is, what an epiphyseal fracture is, where you see a depressed fracture or a green stick fracture, right? And so the table 6.3-1 through 3 really does a good job of showing you an X-ray, a description, a drawing, and then displaying the description, right? And so treatment, how do we talk, when we talk about treatment, what does that mean? Treatment is actually repairing the bone, and usually we have a reduction occurring, so this is actually putting everything back in the right alignments. Sometimes we can have a closed reduction where the bone doctor or the orthopedist will actually manipulate that in the correct position, and sometimes we have to then utilize tools like pins, wires, sometimes screws. Screws don't get used as often anymore, or plates to actually get the bone into alignment, and then we call that an open reduction. So closed versus open reduction. When we immobilize a bone, that's crucially important for healing, is not to use the bone and keep it in that alignment so healing will occur. We can do that by several different means, but a cast is one of them as an example, or what we call traction, right? Leaving the parts of where the bone is broken and not moving that, keeping it immobile, right? So when we talk about repairing, I just want to quickly go over this, but this involves 4 stages, and here are the 4 stages there. We see those there. So number 1, a hematoma forms. This is a big old blood clot. Basically, you see the bone broke, and you see blood has pooled and clotted, forming this clot. We call this a hematoma. We see a callus start to form, and we start to see fibroblasts begin to secrete collagen fibers. We see cartilage forming, and we see a callus forming. So we start to see the soft, cartilage-like and fibrous tissue forming in place of the hematoma, starting to form then bone. And this is remnants of what you see in fetal development, correct? Right? You see cartilage forming first, and then you see bone. And this is actually how this works here when you see healing. Cartilage fibrous connective tissue is starting to form, and then will be replaced with, and you see that there in number 3. And again, this is within the first week, and then about a week from there, you start to see this callus formation. This will go from this point, week 1, all the way to about 2 months or so. We start to see callus forming, and you start to see spongy bone there. And eventually, if it's going to be compact bone, it'll be compact bone, number 3. And then we see this kind of remodeling here, right? Over and over again. And this can vary. So it says 2 months, right? But that can be longer, but not much shorter than about 6 weeks. And so usually when they say it just depends on the conditions, depends on the situation, but bone breakage is usually a 6 to 8 week healing process. And that's the reason why they tell you 6 to 8 weeks, because it takes a while for that fibrocartilage, the hematoma to form, and then the fibrocartilage to kind of start, filling their spots, and it's still soft. And then we see this callus formation and the bone finally hardening, and that takes 6 to 8 weeks, and that's kind of where you see that there as well. And we'll see this for several more months afterwards where we see remodeling. So we'll see this kind of editing, if you will, of the bone there until we see the bone back to normal, right? All right, so there's the four steps. Okay, really quick on some disorders, right? Disorders are really from an imbalance of making bone and taking bone away, and this is what you see here, and that's why we talk about these. And so they really fall into these 3 major ones. There are some other ones out there, but these are the major ones. These are the ones that we see that most, right? This is osteomalacia. This is from bone that's become really poorly mineralized. So if you don't have minerals, the bone is not nearly as hard as it should be. Osteoids are produced, right? But the calcium doesn't get deposited, the salts, okay? The minerals don't get deposited correctly. As a result, you have bones that are soft, weak. They are susceptible to breakage or damage. They will be painful because if you bear weight on those bones, then they're very painful. Osteomalacia of children is also known as rickets, right? And this happens in children. And this is really because we have a lack of minerals, right? One being calcium. Okay, so we don't get enough calcium in the diet as a child, or we don't get enough vitamin D. Now, what is vitamin D used for? Vitamin D is used to bring calcium from the food we eat into blood and into bone. That's what vitamin D functions as. It is a carrier of calcium from food into then blood and into the bone. So if you don't get enough vitamin D, you can get all the calcium in the world, right, in your food, but if you don't have enough vitamin D, you can't carry that calcium into your bones. So rickets really come from poor vitamin D and or poor calcium intake. In osteoporosis, this is a group of diseases, so it's not, osteoporosis is one term to describe a group, right, where reabsorption, breakdown, exceeds the deposit of bone. The matrix is normal, bone mass declines. So we see that occurring most of all in spongy bone and in the neck of the femur, because those 2 places are areas where they're most susceptible to breakage, right? So, and in particular, we see breakages occur more frequently in hips and in vertebral cavity. So on the top here, figure 617, we see a normal bone, and we see our nice little trabeculae, our spongy bone, where we see these holes that are filled up with bone marrow. And we see part B, an osteoporotic bone, where you see holes in the holes, right, basically. So this is where we start to see eating away occurring. This weakens the bone tremendously. Who's at risk for this? Age, postmenopausal women. And in fact, women age 60 to 70 years, about 30% of those women will get some form of osteoporosis. And that number increases to 70% by age 80. And we see that occurring, right? So what plays a role, and why do we see this a lot in women per se? Well, we go back to the hormone estrogen. That's a female sex hormone. That plays a huge role in taking in calcium and modeling calcium, or adding it to the matrix, right? That plays a role in what we know to be bone density, right? So when menopause hits, right? Menopause hits, and that's usually around 40 and over. When that hits and we see a drop in estrogen, we see a drop in bone density, because they're related, directly, right? Since men operate with primarily testosterone as their sex hormone, men are less prone to osteoporosis because testosterone drops not sharply, but it does drop, but it's over a long period of time. So testosterone levels don't drop it nearly as sharply as estrogen, right? So here's some additional risk factors for osteoporosis, right? Not enough stress on the bones. I can't stress this about stress enough, right? Can't stress this about stress enough. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about not using or not applying weights or stress on your bones. Well, what's a great way to do that? Become active, be active, right? And so we see this a lot where people are not active and not using weights, which means being active, exercising, going out, walking, running, cycling, biking, whatever. And we see this a lot when people become stationary or stable. People stay in their houses a lot, on their couches a lot, sitting down a lot. This actually adds to an increase in osteoporosis, and we actually see this rise. There's a rise in osteoporosis in the United States. The diet has a lot to do with it, right? Don't have enough calcium or protein in your diet, those two of which are extremely needed for bone. Smoking actually affects hormone levels, can affect bone matrix making, and that affects that. It also, smoking also affects estrogen levels as well, believe it or not. Genetics has a lot to do with it. Of course, your genetics. Hormone-related conditions like diabetes mellitus also affects risks of osteoporosis. Alcohol also does that too. Consumption of alcohol will then disrupt hormone levels and vitamin mineral levels. And so how do you treat osteoporosis? Calcium is one big thing. Calcium supplements, drinking things, eating things that have high calcium levels. Dairy is one big one. Vitamin D supplements, right? Taking vitamin D. Weight-bearing exercises. Sometimes hormone replacement therapy is a good option. That's a limited option, right? You can take these as well. These are prescribed medication for osteoporosis, right? So how do you prevent it? Plenty of calcium early in adulthood, even as a child. That's why milk is the drink of choice for elementary, middle, junior, high schools, because that is actually calcium intake, right? Actually consuming less carbonated beverages, alcohol, those, what they do is take minerals away, as I mentioned, consuming less of those, and weight-bearing exercise. That's probably the biggest one you can do is weight-bearing exercise, right? That is an important tool for that. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a visit from the gym. that can actually be working, doing stuff around your house, lifting things. That's a way to, as a weight bearing exercise or exercise. Paget's disease, right? This is then a excessive bone deposit and reabsorption, so it's not in a proper level, not in a proper method of doing this. And so we see this. You usually see it in the spine and the pelvis, the femur and the skull. That rarely occurs before 40, so we don't see this in 40. Under 40, we see this past 40, normally speaking. A lot of reasons why this might actually occur, but we're not really sure. It can possibly be a viral infection. That's one of the possibilities there. And then we can treat this with hormones and medication, right? So this is Paget's disease. It's kind of moth-like appearance, moth-eaten appearance. So you can see this here, right? So here is the hip, right? This is the flared part of the hip, and then you can actually see this missing area, right? These little missing sections here. You can also see it down there as well. Part of this here, the edge of this of the femur there, and part of that as well. So lots of places you can see pagetic bone, right? Okay, so just really quick on some developmental things before we leave, right? The embryonic skeleton will ossify, so you can see that easily on an x-ray or sonogram, so you can see ossification occur. And you start to see that again, 8 weeks. That's usually the time period, 8+, right? We see the primary ossification centers in week 12. That's, again, you can see that in an x-ray or a sonogram, and you can see it occurring there. And again, most long bones are ossified except at the epiphysis at birth. The epiphyseal plate will still continue all the way to adolescence. By age 25, really all bones are completely ossified. Skeletal growth ceases or stops, and we don't see any growth there as well. All right, so this is 12 weeks, by the way, right? Here's your primary ossification centers. You can see, let's just pick on the femur here, but you can see the femur that I've drawn there, right? All there, but you don't see, and what's missing is right here at the ends of the epiphysis, right? So you see that there is still cartilage, right? Look at this, right? Really interesting. That's your humerus, right? It's your arm bone there. And look at the primary ossification centers, and then at the very ends, you can see then just cartilage, right? So it's week 12, you can see this forming there. Interesting stuff, right? Look at the hands. Pretty cool stuff. All right, so again, moving on to, adults, right? We see change there also, right? Bone density changes, right, over a lifetime. Again, it's determined by genetics. Genetics plays a big role for your bone density. But in the 4th decade, about 40 years of age, no matter if you're a man or woman, bone mass, mineralization, the healing ability starts to go down. And so we see this, all this declining, as is everything in your body starts to decline.